two different schools, because of the different dynamics coming into it, there was an animosity, but there was that frustration of the disparities even between the two schools. And we had to get over that, and we had to talk that through before we could actually start to talk about the change. And without that student level data, without not just the numerical data, but the experiential data to say, before we talk about what's working, this is what's making us upset. And that took a lot of work, and it took a lot of struggle to get to that point. So that's kind of what I took away from that. It's more the experiential data, and the interventions came later.
All right, I'm gonna skip over, and Gracie, I know that the enrollment team, facilitating it, has been able to use not just the enrollment data, but then also get into the financial aid form completion data from the California Student Aid Commission. And I was just wondering if you could just talk briefly, we're gonna keep moving along for time so that you all can start talking to each other, but talk a little bit about how having that student level data has kind of changed the way that nonprofits and the schools are working together to really focus on the students who need to complete those forms.
Yeah, so I would, I think actually both on readiness and enrollment, and actually I would argue across the board, having access to student level data turns numbers into people, and that's incredibly important in the work that all of us are trying to do, is that, you know, we can look at data all day, we can talk about data all day, but we have to look at the people and what the actual challenges are that our students are facing. And so being able to collaborate with Marin Promise, particularly Cameron, and having these partnerships to have access to that information allows us to work so much more effectively with the school. So I'm looking at my CCC partners here right in front, but being able to collaborate to support specific students and to work one-on-one with every single student to get them across the finish line with financial aid that's how it has to be done. And so we have so many community partners who are sitting here in this room that are a part of that process now because we have access to the information we need. So, you know, Huckleberry knows which students of theirs need more specific support. The students that are going to be enrolling at College of Marin, we know who still needs to fill out financial aid applications so we can catch them before summer bridge. It's just made the whole process of collaboration so much more effective. And yes, we've been able to increase the numbers pretty significantly, which is wonderful, but more importantly, we've been able to support more students in a way that's tailored to their individual needs.
Great. Thank
Shelley,
you. Yeah.
Just a quick note. I think one thing that we've learned from Collective Impact, the advantage, and this is for all of the action teams here, is that it forces us when we're looking at data to ask who's missing, who aren't we covering? And so we don't just sit back and we're content in saying, okay, we've got the target list, but we're always asking ourselves, who else do we need to add to that list?
Exactly. And I recall it wasn't until we all got in the room, okay, we've got these 20 students and you're working with those 15 students, but we know from looking at the data that there's, you know, 300 students and half of them are not in a program. So how are you going to touch those students and find them and work between the college and career counselors and the CBOs to make sure that that everybody gets touched. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and move on to the 3 milestones that deal with college and career. So getting students ready and enrolled and then completing college. And what I'd like to have you talk a little bit about is kind of what's different about the work that's collaborative countywide, but then even go into what opportunities do you see moving forward about having action teams that are all dealing with college and career working together going forward. So talking a little bit around keeping every door open in the readiness and the bringing together of possible policy changes with student supports and how that fits in with the enrollment work that's going on and then also the completion work. So I'm going to go ahead and
So I think for Novato Unified, one of the strengths of the Marin Promise Consortium has really been that we're interfacing with the districts across Marin County And so, there's such strengths in numbers. It's kind of like being the lone wolf versus going with the pack. And so it's really comforting and empowering to be in a room with my colleagues in San Rafael and across the county as we're thinking about these policy changes and how we want to roll them out. Everything that we do that sort of asks for more rigor and more from us takes a lot of education. It takes a board that's committed, that understands what this entails and has thought it through in a way that's successful. And so I just think the collective mind work that's happening in Marin is what is going to be what gets us where we want to be collectively. So
I think there's also, when you create more seats at the table, there are so many more opportunities to learn from each other, which has been a huge part of this whole process for me personally. But even just like with work around financial aid specifically, we started that work in Novato and learned so many amazing things with our partnership through NUSD, and then we're able to take it to San Rafael. And so now we're able to do this work kind of across the county, and we're learning things that we can do in the TAM district as well. So there's just so many opportunities to collaborate and learn from each other, which is vital in this work.
I think the structure also reinforces the notion that we should be looking at a pipeline, that it needs to be sustained effort. It can't be one-off efforts. And so because of that, we're always listening to each other about where are we on the continuum. I think the other thing that occurred to us is that there are such wonderful unintended consequences that come from collective impact. What we do internally at the College of Marin, so Dr. Kuhn convenes high school administrators and now middle school administrators along with community partners annually at a breakfast where we share data. We share new programming that we're offering, but we want to hear from our partners as well. So that would occur anyway, just because of Dr. Kuhn's leadership. But I think we know that that's also supporting the collective impact that we have. Amy asked me this morning about the role of high school counselors. That's huge. So with the Summer Bridge program, we're obviously recruiting within our normal high school recruitment process, but we know that we depend so heavily upon the high school counselors, our community-based organizations, to be talking to their cohorts and their students about the value of that transition. So once again, it's not a singular effort. It's amplified, and we also know that when students hear the same message from a number of voices, it goes deeper and has a better.
Well, and I wanted to add too that when we talk about institutional change, and that's a lot of the focus of what we're doing is trying to affect change on a county-wide scale. But I also, because of part of the math team and some of the college readiness teams, what I took away from the math readiness team is that sometimes a very small change can make a very big impact and can be scaled up to other larger districts, like in the math readiness team, because it's specific to TAM and based at MLK and Willow Creek. But one of the things we were seeing as far as math performance was purely based on placement. Some students just not being placed correctly, or their test scores were placing them inaccurately at times. And also because of the registration process and students not having easy access to just registering at the high schools. And so I know one of the things we did with the math team was really just have a concerted effort in the TAM and the middle school systems to push all the students into and facilitate the registration early. Right. And so from one year to the next, we saw the math scores increase because of those placements. Just a small tweak to the fact that we realized in talking that it wasn't about necessarily just about the ability of the students and the skills they were bringing in or the gaps that they had in their math performance, but that they were already beginning behind because they were being placed in the wrong math class.
And continuing on with that idea in terms of the placement and the connection between math and then readiness and then enrollment, placement in Algebra 1 sets a student up to be able to have all of the correct classes that they need to be qualified for the UC and CSU system. And so if they're not placed in a math class that puts them behind along that trajectory, and Amy, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about the keeping every door open, some of the policy changes around the A to G, UC-CSU eligibility work that then leads into when, Gracie, you see them in senior year and they're enrolling, that shouldn't be the first time that the student realizes, oh, gee, I don't have the classes that I need to apply for UC or CSU. it starts in 8th grade. I mean, it starts all the way back in kindergarten, and literacy so that they can do the word problems when they get to math, and then they get placed in the right algebra class. But Amy, if you wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I think one of the indexes that school districts are always judged by is our graduation rate. And I think too often I see school systems who get to that graduation rate and say, oh, 83% last year, that's too bad. And don't really dig beneath that. And I think the strength of this group and how we're approaching this problem is my kids who are not graduating in 2020, that problem started in 4 years ago, right? There is a lot of research out of Chicago that that freshman failure rate is one of the most critical indicators of whether a child will get the high school diploma. So it's really narrowing the lens on where we know those kids fail. Just to sort of paint a visual image for you about one of the most powerful days that we had with Marin Promise, we sat down with our high school counselors from all of our high schools in a room with the Marin Promise data team, and we basically did an autopsy, is the best way to describe that. We looked at our kids who hadn't hit that marker the year prior, and we went back through their transcripts, and we said, where did we as a system fail this kid? And then let's change the system to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. One of the things that we're doing that we're most proud of is our partnership with College of Marin, making sure that freshmen know from day one what A through G is, how they get into colleges, even financial aid they learn about, and then we support them for those 4 years, circling back to those lessons, making sure they understand how to get into the futures that they're looking for. And additionally, we're working with West Ed and our Equity Blueprint to look at that freshman failure rate and find new ways to impact those kids, to change their story in that 4 year prior so that we get to that moment that is the high school diploma.
Well, I would really like to thank all of you for sharing your stories and giving everyone in this room a sense of the cradle to career experiences that you've had, and wanted to now bring that in terms of changing the system back to the audience here. So let's give a big round of applause. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring Elizabeth. You can turn your microphones off. We'll turn them off over here as well. Thank you. Up, and she is going to lead you and facilitate you. One of the roles that we have as facilitators in an activity along the cradle to career.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Stoner, and two values that guide me in this work are joy and dignity for myself and others. And so in the spirit of joy, I'm also a volleyball coach, so I bring a lot of that to my facilitation skills. We're all going to stand up for a second. And we're all doing a lot of great work. You guys heard a lot of great work up here on the stage, so I want you to find somebody else at your table, give them a high five, a fist bump, a hug, a handshake, whatever you're comfortable with. It's time to wake up. Awesome. All right, we're feeling a little joy now? Little joy? Okay, so stay standing for a second. Stay standing for a second. And I want you to, we're very much together in this space, which I think is great, but I want you to orient yourself to who's at your table right now. So maybe make a little circle, face each other. And if you are a facilitator, please raise your hand. If nobody is raising your hand at your table, please appoint somebody at your table to be the facilitator. No pressure. All the instructions for this activity are on your table, so you'll be fine. So go ahead and have a seat. Can you switch to the next slide? Yeah. All right, so this activity is all about finding your place on the continuum. You guys heard from the panelists. Knowing where you are, knowing who's right before you, knowing who's right after you is a part of how we all align this continuum. So we're going to start off with finding our own place, and then we're going to learn where everybody else's place is at your table. Before we start being a facilitator, it's really important to make sure we have some group agreements so that we're having equitable conversations at the table. I picked a couple of the ones that are my favorite, so
using I statements, using inclusive statements like yes and, step up or step back. So if you're someone who is normally listening and not talking a lot, take this as an opportunity to share your voice. And if you're somebody who's always sharing, take this as an opportunity to practice your listening and make room for everybody at the table. Be respectful, practice that deep listening, and listen to understand. So take a minute just to feel some of those agreements. And then, you want to switch? All right, and now this is our activity. So we're going to start off with finding your place on the continuum. If you guys can pull out the action team fact pages from your folder. And then I'd recommend probably pulling out the fact page that's most related to your work, or whichever one looks super cool. And then you're going to look at the front page of it in the About the Equity Gap section. And what's listed in that section are factors that the action teams have identified as things affecting the milestone for students. So the first step of this activity, and you're going to do this silently with yourself for a minute, is you're going to look over that section and you're going to pick out, it's a lot of paper. You're going to pick out one factor that is most relevant to you and your work. So one action team fact page, About the Equity Gap section, and one factor that's most relevant to you and your work. You're going to write that factor down on a Post-it that should be at your table, along with your name, and you're going to stick that factor on your continuum, which is the big flip chart paper on your table as well. So I'll repeat the directions one more time. Action team fact page, one factor that's most relevant to you and your work. Write it down on a Post-it in your own brief words. You don't have to copy it word for word. And then put it on the continuum. So I will give you a couple minutes to do that right now. Individual activity to start. Hey, Maria, another table have a... So if you've been able to identify a factor and put it on a Post-it note, can you just put your thumb up in the air so I can gauge how much of the room has completed the first step? You don't have to hold it. I'll see you. Question? So if you haven't written down a factor, now is your chance to do it. I know that there's a lot of factors that we all want to talk about. Let's just pick one for now. Okay, great. So here's part two. You guys have all identified a factor that's most relevant to you. You've placed it on the continuum. You see where it falls. But all of these factors are real life stories happening. So I want you to take a minute right now, and I'd appreciate if this was a quiet minute, for you to think of the factor that you picked, and think of a specific experience of a student you worked with, yourself, a family member, a coworker, a friend who experienced this factor in real life. And then also think about, why did this experience stay with you? So take a minute to think of a story of someone experiencing the factor you picked in real life. So hopefully you guys all have a story in mind. And so now we're going to find out where we all fall at our table. So facilitators are going to pick a timekeeper at your table. Feel free to actually get your phone out, use your timer. We're each going to have 2 minutes each. The reason why we have a timekeeper is to make sure that time is shared equally at the table and that everybody's voice is heard. So it's a really important practice. Facilitators, please review the group agreement so that we're present and centered and having a respectful space. And then each person is going to have 2 minutes to share their name, their role or roles, the factor you identified, and briefly the experience you reflected on and why it stayed with you. So facilitator, identify a timekeeper, review the agreements, and then each person is going to go around and share their name, role, the factor they identified, and briefly the story that stayed with them. All right? Have at it.